Recently, I showed you guys how to paint ice effects on your miniatures war gear in my How to Paint Frost Weapons guide. In that video, I asked you for suggestions on what I should tackle next, and a few of your requests were to tackle the exact opposite. So, I'm Pete the Wargamer, and this time around, I'm turning up the temperature to show you how to paint glowing hot power weapons. I started with a Deathwatch Kill Team Power Sword. However, the technique that I'll be demonstrating is easily applicable to other weaponry and even non-40k related weapons too. I began with a black primer, which might seem odd due to the bright nature, but the reason behind it will become apparent soon. I used some of Vallejo's black surface primer through my airbrush, but how you apply your primer is entirely up to you, just so long as it's black. However, if you have primed or base coated your model in a different colour, then all you need to do is to base coat your weapons with black before you begin. After priming, I next set about to create a white wash. I used some of AK Interactive's white paint and mixed it with some airbrush thinner. It doesn't matter which paint or thinner you use here, but I mixed them together until it was about the consistency of milk, like what you see here. With the paint thinned, I applied this over the weapon. As it's been thinned, it can easily be applied over the blade, and as I heavily watered down the paint, it starts to pull away from the edges and pulls in the center of the faces. Because I used a black primer, this resulted in the edges being darker, and so they started to better represent the cooler points of glowing hot metal. Using a little more white paint, this time not quite as heavily watered down as before, I then began to carefully apply it just to the center of the sword's faces. This helped to enhance the intensity of the white in these areas, which was important for my next few steps. At this stage, I had my white blade and the darker edges, but I needed to give it some colour. The first paint to use was the contrast paint Iyanden Yellow. However, instead of using it straight from the pot, which would be much too strong for the time being, I also watered this down with some airbrush thinner. This was then applied over the whole blade, which resulted in a yellow tint. You don't need to use contrast paints here. Regular paints thinned out as a glaze would work too, but you would need something with quite strong pigmentation, so you would look to brands like Vallejo, AK Interactive or Scale Color. Those would probably be good choices for some really intense pigments. Next, I wanted to start my transitions from the yellow to a red and then to a black. So I took some more contrast paint, this time Griffin Orange, and mixed a little into my Iyanden Yellow to create a light orange. This was then applied over just the edges of the blade, the areas that the white was pulled away from. It didn't need to be just over the blade's edges, it could overlap a little onto each of the faces, so long as the center areas of the blade were kept yellow. Following on from the same process as in the last step, I then used some Griffin Orange on its own, but thinned with just a little thinner. This was then applied over the edges once again, but this time I more narrowly focused my application over that hard edge. This resulted in more of a gradient forming from the lightest point in the center of the blade through to yellow, yellowish orange, and then orange as it moves towards the edge. In addition to covering over the edges, I also carefully stippled some of this orange over a few patches on the blade. It is unlikely that the heat would be perfectly distributed, so there would be cooler spots on the blade surface, which I represented with small patches of this orange. To help tie the colours together and also to help smooth out the transitions a little more, I next applied an all-over glaze of Iyanden Yellow, using the same consistency of that I applied in my first application of this. So at this stage I already had the blade's edges, which were a lot darker than the rest of the sword, but I wanted to push this even further. So I used yet more contrast paint, this time some black Templar, and by putting this onto a very thin brush, I could very carefully apply some small flecks to the edges. I didn't want to go along the whole edge here because I wanted the heat distribution again to look uneven, and so some parts of the blade would appear darker and cooler than other parts. Finally, the only thing left to do was to bring in some pure white once again to paint the hottest part of the blade, which were going to be in the center of those faces. So using this white paint once again, I started by very carefully applying a thin layer of white down the center of these faces, before using it then to highlight the very edges of the blade. I imagine that for the blade to have the best cutting power, the sword would focus the heat to these areas, and so they would be white hot. And with that, all that I need to do then was to give the sword a coat of matte varnish to remove some of the glossiness caused by the contrast paints, and that left me with this. And here we have the completed heat-based power sword that is perfect for your fiery forces like the salamanders in 40k. Alternatively, if you wanted to apply them to your fantasy-driven armies, they would be perfect for weapons carried by the Fire Slayers in Age of Sigmar. I hope you enjoyed this guide and found it helpful. It's always a nice change to do smaller, more focused guides like this every now and again, and I'm always keen to hear what techniques you folks would like to see me demonstrate next. So, I just want to finish off with a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters and the folks who use my affiliates links. Your help is always greatly appreciated, and if you like this video, then check out my other guides, and please do consider subscribing. And with that, all that's left to say is, thanks for watching, and goodbye.